Like its string quartet cousin, the saxophone quartet comprises of 4 instruments that all share similar timbres. In terms of range, the highest of the 4 saxophones is the soprano saxophone in B flat, followed by the alto saxophone in E flat, then the tenor saxophone in B flat, and then down the bass is the baritone saxophone in E flat. Now, a couple months back, I released this recording of my first ever saxophone quartet. And ever since, I wanted to demonstrate some of the techniques that we used to create this 3-movement piece. From the very beginning, I wanted the saxophonists to play their instruments as if they're percussionists. So for the first 5 minutes of the piece, we actually don't hear any saxophone pitches at all. Here's a sample of that. Now, how are these sounds produced? Well, let's hear from one of the players to hear exactly what's going on.
The first movement of Saad's quartet requires 3 distinct percussive sounds. First, we get a slap on the body of the saxophone with the palm of the hand. In my case, on the Bari, it sounds like this. Next, we're asked to press down the bell keys on the lowest kind of part of the instrument here, so I'll be pressing these down. In this position, it sounds like this. And then the third sound requires the use of these thimbles here. I've got a couple thimbles on my index and middle finger that help me get a kind of metallic striking sound that sounds like this. We hear those sounds put together in the first couple of measures from this first movement.
Hey, thanks, Bryan. Now let's fast forward to the second movement where we'll hear our first pitches from the saxophones. But instead of playing with the standard 12 notes that we're all used to hearing, this movement establishes a foreign tonal language with the introduction of 6 tones. Now, these are very small micro intervals, and as the name implies, this would take a whole step and divide it into 6 smaller equal steps. Contrast this to our standard semitone, which divides the whole step into just 2 equal steps. Now, when you think about this, this isn't really much of a subdivision, but this is just what we're used to hearing as our smallest interval in Western music. So let's go ahead and hear an excerpt from the second movement. So here you're getting a sense that we're dealing with a musical language not native to our diatonic way of listening to music. Now let's get back to Bryan. Bryan, what did Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the saxophone, think of these small micro intervals, these 6 tones that we're using in this piece?
Adolphe Sax absolutely did not have 6 tones in mind when he dreamed up this instrument back in the late 1830s and early 1840s.
Okay, I see, go on.
This fingering system on the saxophone was designed to fit in our kind of understanding of half steps and whole steps and those sort of diatonic intervals in Western classical music. So producing 6th tones requires some fudging of this initial concept for the saxophone. We'll use adjusted fingerings to either raise or lower a pitch as needed. And some pitches are more stable than others. So for those, we may also have to incorporate additional voicing inside the throat in terms of tongue placement. We might have to apply or decrease jaw pressure to help raise or lower the pitch as well. So you'll hear 6th tones throughout this excerpt from the second movement.
Moving on to the third movement, I imagine the saxophones physically playing inside an oud, which is this type of ancient guitar from the Arab world. This movement depicts the player starting inside the oud and then gradually emerging out of it. Here's a sample from the very beginning of this movement. Now I'm sure Bryan just can't wait to tell you what techniques were used in this movement, so let's head back to him.
The third movement introduces two new sounds to the quartet. The first is what Saad calls a flared crescendo. So a typical crescendo with a sort of funnel shape at the end of it. Saad tells us that flared crescendos indicate to increase volume exponentially rather than linearly. We kind of took that to mean that there should almost be a sort of subtle, explosive release at the end of this crescendo. We're marked from pianissimo to mezzo forte, with that flared crescendo at the end, leading to that kind of almost explosion on the release. That might sound something like this. Rather than a simple pianissimo to mezzo forte crescendo. We also get slap tongue articulations introduced to the quartet in this movement. A slap tongue requires more of a pop articulation sound at the beginning of a tone than the standard articulations you might hear on a saxophone. A typical articulation with no accent, no tenuto, just unmarked articulation might sound something like that. Just general, those are pretty staccato. Slap tongue articulations are going to have a lot more pop, a lot more kind of aggression at the beginning of the tone. Volume tends to increase with these, although they can be done at any volume. And here we have the slap tongue paired with this forzando volume indication, telling us that this should be a pretty strong sound. So you'll hear these flared crescendos and slap tongue articulations in this excerpt from the third movement.
Now as we slowly start to emerge out of this very reverberant sound world and imagine ourselves actually getting outside of this Arabic guitar, I wanted to introduce some new techniques to symbolize that transition. Namely the super high altissimo technique, and then a technique borrowed from the string instruments called tremolo. And then the last one is a super wide, fast kind of vibrato technique. This new sonic palette shows up later in the third movement and sounds like this. Now that we've heard a bit of that, let's head back to Bryan and learn about what's going on here.
The altissimo range, a tremolo effect, and a super wide and super fast vibrato technique. The altissimo range on a saxophone is generally understood to begin where the standard keyed range ends. On my instrument in this case, my keyed range is going to end at high F for concert A flat. So altissimo would begin at my F sharp, concert A, and going up as high as I can comfortably play. Saad asks me in this piece to play a full octave higher than that. The excerpt here only goes up to my C sharp or concert E. The tremolo effect that Saad asks us to create in this passage can be done in a number of ways. In the standard keyed range of the instrument, it's possible to produce a very light and fast legato articulation of the tongue striking the reed. It's also possible to growl in the back of the throat with a kind of an unpitched sort of flutter of like a glottal flutter in here. That's my kind of typically preferred method of flutter tonguing. So that might sound something like this. It's a disruption, a distortion in the sound. Here's a standard tone. The tremolo effects in my part in this case are indicated up in the altissimo register. Because of the voicing required to produce those tones, I can't distort those sounds with my tongue. My tongue has to be in a very specific position inside my mouth to produce and sustain these altissimo tones. So in this case, I find a timbre trill. I will add and kind of rapidly press down a key that doesn't dramatically change the pitch at all. It just kind of slightly alters the color to give that kind of distorted effect while also allowing me to maintain the stability of the tone up high. You'll hear all three of those effects at work in this section. Saad also asks that an extraordinarily wide and fast vibrato be used in this third movement. Typically, vibrato on the saxophone is produced by a subtle wiggle of the jaw, specifically the lower part of the jaw, as a note is being sustained. So that might sound like this. The vibrato that Saad asks for in this third movement is faster and wider, and the way that I produce that, in my case, is to kind of emulate a boa constrictor. I basically just try and imagine unhinging my jaw, releasing all tension here so that it can just flap around and wiggle as quickly and with as much width as possible. That might sound something like this. Saad asks for this to be produced, in my case, up in the altissimo range, so that would sound like this.
Thanks so much, Bryan. So what did you guys think of this way of writing for saxophones? Now, this is definitely not your standard way of writing for saxophones, but I found that saxophonists in general are very open to trying new ideas, and this was definitely the case with Bryan and the Singularity Quartet. Incidentally, I left a link for the full performance of this work down in the description below. Saad Haddad, signing off.